All right. So today, what we're going to talk about is the new and aspiring leader of the Department of Veterans Affairs Veteran Readiness and Employment Program, Miss Chantile Stovall, which has taken a few people by surprise. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and what that's going to mean for veterans here moving forward through 2025 and possibly into 2026 if she stays in that position. So having said that, hey, I'm your host, Benjamin Krause, and I am a veteran rights attorney who's represented veterans against the Department of Veterans Affairs and specifically in fighting for their VR&E benefits for over a decade. Today, we're going to talk about the new leadership that is going to be at the helm in VR&E and what that's going to mean for veterans. I wrote a blog post about it today and want to give people here in the YouTube sphere and Facebook a little more information about my own experiences and what I think that this is probably a signal of. Now, one thing that one of the readers mentioned is that they believe it could be a targeted takedown. So the prior executive director of VR&E Service, whose name was Nicholas Pamprin, and there was some interesting politics behind this move. So I noticed over the past probably 8 months, give or take, that the HVAC, so this would be the House Committee on Veterans Affairs and their oversight, led by Representative Derek Van Orden, a Navy SEAL, retired, and actor, almost attorney. He didn't quite make it. He did 1 year law school through VRD and then got elected out of Wisconsin to the House of Representatives. Now is leading one of the parts of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs looking into VR&E, and they have been for a little while. We're going to talk about that and what it may mean. But anyway, so having said that, Chantile Stovall. So what I do know is that she has been leading within the Seattle regional office and doing other things, but more recently at the Seattle regional office in a leadership role. And one of the things that we're noticing, and this is really from my experience representing veterans for their VR&E benefits, is that the Seattle office plays hardball. So that office is not what I would call veteran friendly when it comes to VR&E benefits. There are some offices that are more reasonable. That office seems to double down and even triple down when they got a case wrong. And so they end up taking quite a bit longer than normal to win. And sometimes they'll make decisions that defy logic. But hey, you know what? That happens when you're dealing with the VA pretty much anywhere. It doesn't need to be Seattle when it comes to lacking logic. But the Seattle office in particular is an office that has tended to double down on bad decisions and to really dig their heels in where they need oversight from outside of that location. So what does this mean for VR&E veterans, given that Chantile Stovall was there? Well, let's get a little bit of her background. So she, as of 2024, what I could find was that she was earning $177,000 in 2024, which is pretty significant. That's definitely higher than the average, median average, I believe it was, or average wage of VA personnel, which is a little bit over $100,000, which I wouldn't have guessed. But come to find out, it looks like the median average is about 90,000, and the average wage is 105,000. So her earnings are, let's see here, the number was 67% more than average and nearly double the median. So very interesting, right? So she's very well paid. That tells us a little bit. It tells us that she's somebody that VA views as a high performer. So if I'm putting high performer here in Camp 1, coupled with running a regional office where veterans are getting shafted probably more often than not, or at least when they shouldn't, that tends to suggest to me that what we're going to see from VRE leadership is a more, I guess you would call it conservative, but a less liberal view about when the benefits shouldn't be granted. This is probably going to mean veterans who normally might be approved in a certain setting are probably going to run into more denials than normal. So again, more denials than normal. That likely means you're going to have to appeal, and you're probably going to need legal help. Fortunately, you have the option of non-lawyer VSOs that do work for free. You have the option of attorneys. Of course, you'll have to usually pay the attorneys to represent you in the appeals process. But strong odds are that veterans are going to need more legal support when it comes to VR&E than in the past. Now, again, this is just the odds. We'll see what happens. It could be that she comes in and regulates underneath the Office of Field Operation and the Margarita Devlin, who is presently, let's see, what was her role? The acting principal deputy undersecretary of benefits. So this is a similar role to what Margarita Devlin had in the past. She is a former VR counselor who moved into leadership about a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, and now is in senior leadership within VA. She is basically the decider in what happens within the regional offices. The person in charge of VR&E service, they're the ones kind of driving the policy. So this is what Chantile Stovall is going to be in charge of, and doing other kinds of things, but a big chunk of it is going to be policy, implementing protocol, creating training, things like that. But field leadership and what they're going to do at the regional offices, that's going to be falling underneath the Office of Field Operation and underneath Margarita Devlin. Now, Devlin happened to present or be giving testimony here recently in July. I think it was July 16th, in front of HVAC. They did not invite Nick Pamperin to talk after he was, I guess I would say, lambasted in the prior hearing in June, and then again in December, where it almost, if I were to guess, almost seemed like a targeted takedown of him to then justify other actions, maybe policies as well as maybe leadership changes, in part because the way the questions were being asked from the HVAC and Derek Van Orden didn't, some of it was fine, but some of it wasn't accurate. You know, the information on which they were relying wasn't correct. And that happened again, some of what they were talking about in June, then it came up again in July. And so it's very clear, at least to me, having represented a lot of veterans against the agency, that the information HVAC has when they're doing their oversight isn't correct. So what would the purpose be of the incorrect information? Well, either one, to get sound bites and you know it's incorrect, but it sounds good, so you're trying to get sound bites. Or two, whoever's advising the members, meaning people like Derek Van Orden, is giving them incorrect information on purpose, and they're running with it. So either way, it's not great for veterans, because what's going to happen is they're going to curtail the extensions that veterans need in order to get additional training, so higher level training. That's going to get hit, most likely. You're going to probably see independent living plans take a hit, as well as small business plans, and as well as, you know, veterans who are trying to get graduate level or professional level training, similar, ironically, than as to what Van Orden received through VR&E. So Van Orden is a Wisconsin veteran, or he lives there now. He served honorably in the Navy, was a SEAL, became, I believe, a chief or something like that. And then after getting out, an actor. Shortly after doing that for a few years, then he went to VR&E, right around probably the time that he got the 100% rating that he has talked about before. And then applied for VRE, was approved, attended Mitchell Hamlin here in St. Paul, Minnesota, and did that for a year and then stopped. I'm not sure why, but VR&E covered his tuition for at least that 1 year. At the time, Mitchell Hamlin was probably considered a high-cost law school, and so he likely took advantage of many of the benefits now that are the target of the committee and the target of some of their oversight, as well as what it looks like is happening. And so we're watchful, hoping that everything works out with Stovall, and hoping that everything works out with Devlin. But I think it's really important to definitely wait and see how things go. One of the things that we appreciate that Margarita Devlin mentioned was, first, she at least took ownership over what's happening in the field, which no one has really done up until this point. And then, in addition to that, she gave them an honest appraisal of how many counselors that they're actually going to need. And it seems like the HVAC committee was a little surprised by that. And I'll cover that a little bit more because I think there needs to be an analysis of the actual questions and the areas that were incorrect. Because, as an attorney myself and a policy advocate, I want to make sure that HVAC is at least operating off of the correct information. And additionally, we want to make sure the veterans aren't harmed and have their benefits reduced. But it does look like they're also going to hire in lesser qualified people to augment the counselor deficit. So for a little bit of background, a lot of people don't know this. So Veteran Readiness and Employment used to be called, 2 iterations ago, Vocational Rehabilitation and Counseling. And apparently leadership at that time believed that veterans had the wrong idea about the program, and so they wanted to focus on employment. And so they changed the name to Vocational Rehabilitation and Employment in about 2004. At around that same time, they also started not hiring counseling psychologists. So at that time, only a counseling psychologist, which usually is a terminal degree or a doctorate, so a terminal master's degree or a doctorate, to perform that role as a counseling psychologist, had greater training and fidelity to doing analyses of veterans' situations. And so I would argue that with their heightened training, that they were able to probably do a better job on the initial evaluations, which is a huge problem for VR&E now because of their drawdown of people retiring, inadequate training, and a lot of local policies being allowed to be implemented where these counselors are not following the law. They're not following what the regulation and statutes actually say. So hopefully we get back to at least that point. But counseling psychologists is where it was at before, and they're the ones that were essentially the deciders, and the case managers were the rehabilitation counselors. Well, then fast forward about 12 years, in 2016, VR&E, because they had stopped hiring them, suddenly had to change their regulations to allow for rehabilitation counselors to do the initial evaluation and related adjudications. So because of the drawdown on counseling psychologists, boom, suddenly we had this particular issue pop up. And unfortunately, now we have a ton of problems, right? Because these counseling psychologists just don't have the training and know-how to actually follow through with the real intent of the program. Now, the intent of the program is, and I'm paraphrasing, if you look it up, 38 CFR 21.1, and that basically means that the VA has to look at the maximum freedom and then the maximum support and benefits to get the veteran qualified for and to gain and maintain suitable employment, right? It's not just to get a job. It's not just to get them out there. Suitable employment. And not just every employment is suitable, right? So they're supposed to really drill down into this. And they just can't. They can't do it well. There are some counselors that do, but the vast majority don't. And they don't understand how evidence works. They don't understand due process. They don't really understand the duty to assist as it relates to veterans' VR&E claims. They really should be treating these claims very similar to what happens with disability compensation. And in there, that's when a separate examiner comes in, does the exam, does their report, hands it off to an adjudicator, and then the adjudicator makes the decision based on the evidence. That's what should happen, but in VR&E, we don't have that. We have the person that does the initial evaluation is usually the counselor that manages the case. So they have an incentive to double down on a bad decision. Unfortunately, it's what we see. And if you do a supplemental claim, you get nailed with that. If you do a higher level review and win, frequently, we see those cases come back to the same counselor that made the underlying error. And guess what? They have an incentive to not grant, unless it depends on the higher level review. So there's a lot of different moving parts. This new team, well, we'll see what they do. Hopefully they follow the law and not the policy. The policy is where veterans run into a ton of problems. But we'll just see. It's just kind of how it goes right now. So with Stovall coming from the Seattle office, I have a lot of concerns. Hopefully she means business. Hopefully that business means that she's going to follow the statutes and regulations and not adhere to this crazy M28C that's impossible to follow. It's impossible to follow because they change it all the time. And these counselors don't even have enough time to manage their own caseload, much less do the legal research required to follow the M28C. It's probably, if you were to break it down, up to about 1,500 pages. It's changing all the time. Frequently, they introduce criteria and roadblocks to veterans that aren't appropriate, but they're doing it anyway. And it's such a big program, it's hard to keep up when they're going with that level of speed. So that's the kind of gist of what's happening here. We have new management. It appears that Pamprin and maybe others were targeted for a takedown. The current administration didn't like the direction this was going. However, I will tell you, the takedown definitely probably started before President Trump was projected to win. But, definitely took up steam after President Trump did win, and definitely after Trump took office. And so now what we see is an attack against VR&E. Now, what is VR&E? In case you don't know, it's the key program for disabled veterans to become vocationally rehabilitated, hence the old name, vocational rehabilitation. So if you're a person with disabilities, this vocational rehabilitation program is there to help you not only get retraining, but also to help you find work that's appropriate, things like that. And unfortunately, this program, it appears that they're going to try to bastardize it into something that's similar to the GI Bill if we're not careful. Now, hopefully, again, Margarita Devlin and Chantile Stovall, they're both counselors, so they both have that experience. Hopefully they aren't interested in destroying the program. I would hope not, just to save a little bit of money. I mean, after all, if we are, as a country, willing to send tens of billions of dollars to the Ukraine to, launder money or whatever they're doing, we want to make sure that, our veterans are at least taken care of. So I have a thing here. Maybe what we ought to do is have a deal with leadership, and the deal should be, hey, let's stop sending bombs to Ukraine and money. And once we eventually stop doing that, then maybe we can start talking about certain benefit reforms and things of that nature. But until then, I think, if we're going to waste a ton of money over there, the last place they should be looking is, trying to make up that difference on the back of disabled vets. It's disgusting. So I'm hoping that the HVAC committee, the one that Van Orden is responsible for, takes a deep look and tries to make sure that they get the information that's necessary, that's appropriate, that they may not be getting. Again, he's a disabled vet too. I'd like for him to, make statements that are based on facts and not ridiculous hyperbole. But lately, I've been seeing a lot of the hyperbole. So we'll see. I'm going to make a good faith effort here to try to get information to him that's correct. If he wants to keep, going down the road and attacking the program, then we'll have to go into a more robust way of messaging to him so that he understands. Anyway, having said that, I see some people made comments here, so that's nice. King asked me about the Chicago office. The Chicago office is one of the other more challenging offices, and it's interesting. What you notice is that offices located in more liberal states are usually veteran friendly, but I don't know. Washington, it's been a bit of a challenge. Illinois, his Chicago office has been historically a problem. St. Paul, not as bad. Boston, not as bad. New York, some of the bigger cities where, there's a lot of veterans out there, but those offices seem to be, fair. But when you go into these other areas like Illinois and Washington and San Diego, just really poor. Some offices in Texas are hit or miss, but it really depends on what's going on. So anyway, I don't have anything to add beyond that. But man, I'll tell you what, if you have an experience with one of these offices, I'd love to hear your comments in the comment section below. I would love to hear what's going on, what your synopsis is of the situation. And until next time, God bless and have a great remainder of the week, okay? Take care.